Perfectionism isn't ambition, it's anxiety in disguise. Freud believed our obsession with flawlessness isn't about success. It's about control, fear, and unresolved childhood wounds. In this video, we'll explore how your inner critic was born, what it's truly protecting, and how to finally silence it, not by working harder, but by understanding the unconscious mind behind it. In today's hyper-competitive, hyper-visible world, perfectionism has become not just a personal trait, but a cultural norm. From social media filters to professional burnout, society increasingly rewards the illusion of flawlessness, even as it quietly erodes psychological well-being. Freud would argue that this isn't mere ambition, it's a symptom of deeper internal conflict. Perfectionism, through a Freudian lens, is not just about striving to be your best. It is the outward expression of a tense battle between the ego, and superego. The superego, the internalized voice of parents, teachers, and culture, imposes rigid standards. It doesn't whisper encouragement. It demands compliance, punishes failure, and drives the ego into submission. The result is a psyche in constant tension, striving for ideal standards to avoid shame, guilt, or feelings of inadequacy. This inner conflict doesn't just impact your productivity, it invades your self-worth. The relentless pursuit of perfection creates chronic anxiety, self-criticism, and emotional paralysis, especially when goals are unmet. People report never feeling good enough, even in success, because the superego always raises the bar. To overcome perfectionism, we must understand its roots not just as a habit, but as a defense, a strategy developed unconsciously to gain approval, avoid rejection, and cope with early experiences where love felt conditional. Freud's theories offer us a mirror, revealing that perfectionism is not a strength to be proud of, but a defense to be understood and dismantled. At the core of perfectionism lies the ego, Freud's rational mediator, caught between the chaotic desires of the id and the unforgiving judgments of the superego. While the ego is meant to balance internal conflict with external reality, under pressure, it often turns to perfectionism as a coping strategy. It seeks control not out of clarity, but out of fear of failure, judgment, and rejection. Freud saw the ego's drive for mastery as both protective and limiting. When shaped by early childhood experiences where love or safety were conditional, be good and you'll be accepted, achieve and you'll be praised, the ego begins to associate perfection with survival. It learns that flaws are dangerous and that mistakes invite punishment. This forms a subconscious rule: only the perfect deserve love. As individuals grow, society reinforces this script. Education systems reward compliance and flawless performance. Social structures praise success while punishing vulnerability. Over time, the ego internalizes these pressures and transforms them into compulsive behaviors. Obsessive planning, hypercriticism, fear of delegation, and chronic self-doubt masked as high standards. But perfectionism is not confidence, it's the ego's silent panic. Beneath the pursuit of flawlessness lies a terror of being seen as weak, unworthy, or out of control. The perfectionist doesn't chase excellence, they flee inadequacy. Freud would argue that to heal, we must confront not the drive itself, but the fear that fuels it. To truly understand perfectionism, Freud would have us look beneath the surface, into the unconscious, where buried conflicts and repressed fears shape our waking behaviors. Here, the superego plays a dominant role. It is the internalized voice of authority, parents, teachers, culture, religion, all merged into one moral overseer. When this voice becomes rigid or punitive, it forms an ideal self that is impossible to live up to. Perfectionism, through the Freudian lens, is not just a personality trait. It is a symptom, a symptom of unresolved conflicts from early development. For instance, a child raised in an environment where affection is earned through achievement may internalize the belief, "I must always be perfect to be loved." This unresolved tension becomes psychic residue, festering in the unconscious and surfacing later in compulsive striving, guilt, or self-loathing. The ego, under pressure from both the id and the superego, deploys defense mechanisms to manage this internal war. Perfectionists often rely on reaction formation, masking feelings of inadequacy by presenting an over-controlled persona. Or projection, attributing their own fear of failure to others, even undoing, performing rituals or overworking to erase perceived imperfections. Left unexamined, these defenses create a prison of repetition. The perfectionist becomes trapped, not by reality, but by the echo of an internalized past. Freud would urge us to ask, whose standards am I trying to live up to? Only through this confrontation can we begin to unravel the unconscious drivers of perfectionism and reclaim our autonomy from the superego's impossible demands. If the superego fuels perfectionism through the voice of judgment, then healing begins by softening that voice. Freud acknowledged that liberation comes not through denial, but through understanding, through shining light on the unconscious forces that bind us. Reframing perfectionism is not about abandoning ambition, but about transforming its source from fear-driven compulsion to conscious self-direction. The first step is to redirect one's sense of worth from external validation, praise, awards, approval, to internal satisfaction. The perfectionist, driven by unconscious guilt and a need to please the internalized other, must begin to ask, what brings me fulfillment, even if no one applauds? This marks a crucial shift from being object to becoming subject, reclaiming agency over one's own narrative. A healthier ego doesn't fear failure. It recognizes failure as part of the human condition. Success and failure, in this view, are not moral judgments, but learning experiences. Freud would call this the integration of the ego ideal with the real self, moving from fantasy toward reality without shame. Most crucially, self-acceptance requires the cultivation of compassion, the antidote to the superego's tyranny. When we embrace our imperfection, we cease to be at war with ourselves. We begin to see our flaws not as defects, but as portals to connection, empathy, and growth. Only then can the perfectionist's mask drop, revealing not a broken self, but a whole one, finally allowed to breathe. Freud taught us that awareness is the beginning of transformation, that bringing unconscious conflicts into consciousness grants us the power to choose differently. Modern therapy builds on this foundation with practical techniques to untangle the roots of perfectionism and replace them with healthier patterns. One of the most effective tools is cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which allows individuals to challenge and reframe the rigid, all-or-nothing thinking perfectionism thrives on. When the inner critic says, if it's not perfect, it's worthless, CBT helps expose that distortion and replace it with a balanced truth. Doing my best is meaningful, even if it's not flawless. This process empowers the ego to respond with logic rather than fear. Mindfulness is another powerful ally. It quiets the obsessive voice of the superego by anchoring us in the present. Through breathwork, body awareness, and non-judgmental observation, the individual learns to witness their perfectionistic thoughts without identifying with them. Instead of reacting compulsively, we begin to respond thoughtfully, a sign of an integrated, mature ego. But some perfectionistic patterns are deeply entrenched, often linked to childhood wounds and internalized parental figures. In such cases, professional support becomes essential. Psychodynamic therapy, especially when guided by a trained analyst, can help decode the symbolic roots of behavior, not just treating the symptoms, but healing the source. Transformation is possible, but it begins by daring to be imperfect. Perfectionism isn't a flaw to fix. It's a message from the unconscious, waiting to be understood. When we stop chasing the illusion of flawlessness, we begin the real work of self-acceptance. Freud showed us that true strength lies not in control, but in insight. Embrace your imperfections. They are the most human part of you, and in that there is power.